When you picture Africa, you see the Serengeti. You see lions stalking through golden grass, elephants gathering at waterholes, giraffes browsing from acacia trees under an endless sky. You imagine this as the last pristine wilderness, an untouched corner of the planet where nature still operates as it always has. But you're looking at a ghost. You're standing in a graveyard wearing the mask of paradise. The Africa you think you know is merely a faint shadow, a depleted remnant of an ecosystem so ferocious, so dense with massive life, and so ruthlessly competitive that the word wilderness barely begins to describe it. What existed here for millions of years was not simply wild. It was an arena where titans clashed, where death stalked from the trees and the grass and the sky in forms we can barely reconstruct. This was prehistoric Africa, the most dangerous and diverse terrestrial ecosystem Earth has ever assembled. Tonight we are going to step back through 7 million years to witness a world that makes the modern savannah look tame by comparison. So settle in, let the day fall away, and prepare to meet the monsters that once ruled this continent before they vanished into the fossil record, leaving only whispers in the stone. Before we begin our journey into the deep past, take a moment to subscribe if you enjoy these explorations through time, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Now, dim the lights, find your comfort, and let us drift backward through the millennia to a time when Africa was truly alive with giants. To understand what was lost, we must first see what existed. 7 million years ago, Africa was not the continent we recognize today. The climate was fundamentally different, shaped by forces operating on scales so vast that human intuition struggles to grasp them. The entire planet was warmer. The ice caps we take for granted, the great white shields at the poles had not yet fully formed. Antarctica was still, transitioning from a green fringe world to a frozen tomb. The Arctic Ocean flowed freely. In this warmer greenhouse Earth, Africa sat at a crossroads. It was the cradle where the ancient supercontinent Gondwana had finally shattered, sending South America and India drifting away like broken pieces of a vast jigsaw puzzle. Africa remained, anchored in place, slowly rotating northward into the subtropical belt where it would collide with Europe and Asia, creating the Mediterranean basin as a vast unstable wound between continents. During this epoch, what we call the late Miocene, northeastern and eastern Africa, were not dominated by endless grasslands. They were draped in a mosaic of forests and woodlands. Imagine a landscape more akin to the modern Congo basin, extended far to the east and north, a verdant tapestry of rivers, lake margins and gallery forests threading through open patches. The trees were massive, their canopies forming a living ceiling that filtered the sunlight into dappled green pools on the forest floor. This was a world ruled not by grass, but by leaves. The herbivores that thrived here were browsers, creatures built to reach high, to strip bark, to pluck fruit from branches. They lived in a vertical world where food grew upward and survival meant competing for height. But beneath this green surface, a slow catastrophe was beginning. The atmospheric concentration of carbon dioxide, the invisible gas that controls the planet's thermostat and dictates which plants can thrive, was falling. Over millions of years, the weathering of rocks, the burial of organic carbon in ocean sediments, and the relentless churn of tectonic forces were pulling CO2 out of the air. Plants breathe carbon dioxide. For trees and most leafy vegetation, known as C3 plants, lower CO2 means harder work. They struggle to photosynthesize efficiently, but grasses, specifically a type known as C4 grasses, have evolved a biochemical trick they can operate efficiently even when carbon dioxide levels are low. As the atmospheric CO2 dropped below 400 parts per million and continued to fall, the advantage shifted. The trees began to lose ground. The grasses began to spread. This was not an overnight transformation. It unfolded across millions of years, a creeping invasion of open habitat into the once forested realm. The woodlands fractured into patches. The grasslands expanded, first appearing as scattered clearings, then growing into vast unbroken plains. By 5 million years ago, much of East Africa had transitioned into a new kind of environment, a mix of woodland and grassland known as savanna. This was not a gentle change. It was an ecological revolution. The vertical world was being replaced by a horizontal one, and everything that lived here had to adapt, move, or die. The fossil sites tell the story with brutal clarity. In the sediments of Lothagam, along the western shore of Lake Turkana in northern Kenya, paleontologists have unearthed bones that paint a picture of the transition. 7.5 million years ago, this region was teeming with species that would look utterly alien to anyone familiar with modern Africa. There were 3 species of proboscideans, relatives of modern elephants but stranger. Deinotherium, a colossal browser with tusks that curved downward from its lower jaw like twin pickaxes, used these bizarre appendages to strip bark and dig for roots. These animals weighed up to 14 tons, making them larger than the largest African elephants alive today. Their skeletons reveal bodies built for a forest world, powerful legs designed to push through dense undergrowth, trunks adapted for selective feeding on leaves and branches. Alongside them roamed multiple species of rhinoceros, not the 2 species clinging to survival today, but a diverse guild of grazers and browsers, each filling a different niche in the ecological machine. There were giraffids, ancient relatives of the modern giraffe, including the extraordinary Civatherium, a short-necked behemoth with massive ossicones, bony protrusions from the skull that gave it the appearance of wearing a crown of horns. Civatherium was built like a fusion of a giraffe and a bison, a heavyweight browser that could reach high into the canopy, but also possessed the bulk to defend itself from predators. It weighed close to 2 tons and moved through the woodlands like a living battering ram. And there were hippos, not just the one species we know, but several, including forms that had adapted to different water sources and feeding strategies. The sheer diversity of large herbivores, animals over 1,000 kilograms in body mass, was staggering. At any given site from this period, you might find 10 or more megaherbivore species coexisting, a density of titans that has no parallel in any ecosystem on Earth today. Even the richest modern protected areas in Africa host only 5 such species. The Miocene was an age of abundance, a world built on the foundation of plants turning sunlight into flesh, and flesh being converted into the muscle and bone of giants. But the engine that powered this abundance was beginning to sputter. As the grassland spread, the rules changed. Browsers that fed on woody plants began to struggle. Their food sources were fragmenting, retreating into isolated pockets. Grazers, animals that could thrive on the tough fibrous grasses, began to multiply and diversify. The fossil record shows this shift happening over millions of years. By 4.6 million years ago, the diversity of megaherbivores had begun to decline. Species vanished. Not in a sudden catastrophe, but in a slow, grinding attrition. The woodlands could no longer support the same biomass of giant browsers. The landscape was opening up, becoming drier, more seasonal, more hostile to the towering titans of the green world. And when the herbivores began to fail, the carnivores that depended on them felt the tremor. The ecological architecture was beginning to crack, and the age of giants was drawing toward its inevitable, brutal close. The loss was not immediate, but it was inexorable. Africa was being rewritten, line by line, species by species, from a forest empire into a grassland battlefield. While the herbivores were the architects of the landscape, shaping the vegetation and cycling nutrients through their immense bodies, they were not alone. Moving through the dappled shadows of the woodlands and stalking across the emerging grasslands was an array of predators so diverse and so fearsome that the modern carnivore guilds of Africa and Asia pale in comparison. This was the golden age of the carnivore, a time when multiple lineages of killing machines competed for the same prey, driving each other to evolutionary extremes of size, strength, and lethality. To walk through prehistoric Africa was to live under constant threat from creatures built solely for the purpose of bringing down giants. The most iconic of these predators were the saber-toothed cats, but not the famed Smilodon of the Americas. Africa had its own lineages, just as deadly and just as specialized. Meganterion was a medium-sized saber-tooth, roughly the size of a modern jaguar, but armed with elongated, blade-like canines that could reach 15 centimeters in length. These teeth were not for biting through bone. They were precision instruments designed to deliver a killing stroke to the throat or belly of prey, slicing through soft tissue and major blood vessels with surgical efficiency. Meganterion was an ambush hunter, a patient killer that stalked the forest edges and the scrublands, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Its forelimbs were heavily muscled, built for grappling and holding struggling prey while the killing bite was administered. It was a specialist in bringing down animals much larger than itself, targeting young elephants, rhinos, and hippos when they were vulnerable. But Meganterion was not the only saber-tooth prowling the continent. Dinophilis, sometimes called the false saber-tooth, had shorter, stouter canines, and a build that suggested it was a versatile hunter, capable of taking prey of various sizes. Its name means terrible cat, and it lived up to the title. Fossil evidence from South African caves shows that Dinophilis preyed on early hominins, dragging our ancestors into dark limestone caverns, where their bones accumulated alongside those of baboons and antelopes. We were not the apex predator in this world. We were prey. Our skeletons bear the puncture marks of carnivore teeth, evidence that we huddled in the trees at night, listening to the sounds of death in the darkness below. And then there was Homotherium, the scimitar-toothed cat. Unlike the dirk-toothed saber-tooths with their long, fragile canines, Homotherium had shorter, serrated blades. This cat was built for endurance, not just for the sudden violent takedown. Its limbs were long and graceful, its body lean and athletic. Studies of its skeleton suggest it may have been a pursuit predator, capable of chasing prey over long distances much like modern hyenas do today. Homotherium had a sloping back, massive shoulders, and partially retractable claws that functioned almost like cleats, giving it traction during a chase. It likely hunted in packs or family groups, working together to bring down juvenile mammoths and other megaherbivores. This was not a solitary assassin. It was a coordinated killer, and it roamed across Africa, Europe, and Asia, dominating the ecosystems of the Pliocene and Pleistocene for millions of years. But the saber-tooths did not have the killing fields to themselves. Competing for the same carcasses, and often stealing kills outright, were the giant hyenas. In the modern world, the spotted hyena is already a formidable predator, capable of taking down wildebeest and zebra with terrifying efficiency. But the prehistoric hyenas were something else entirely. Pachyrhacota brevirostris, the giant short-faced hyena, was the size of a lioness, weighing up to 330 pounds. It had a massive skull equipped with bone-crushing jaws that could splinter the femur of an elephant. Unlike modern hyenas, which are active hunters, Pachyrhacota seems to have been a specialized scavenger and kleptoparasite. It followed the saber-tooths, waiting for them to make a kill, and then moved in with overwhelming force, driving the cats away and claiming the carcass for itself. The fossil dens of Pachyrhacota are nightmarish treasure troves. These hyenas dragged entire limbs and skulls back to their lairs, accumulating massive bone deposits. Inside these ancient caves, the floors are carpeted with the remains of hundreds of individuals, rhinos, elephants, horses, all gnawed and cracked open to extract the marrow. The hyenas did not just scavenge. They processed every part of the carcass, leaving behind only the largest, densest, bones. They were the recyclers of the Pleistocene, ensuring that nothing went to waste in the brutal economy of the savannah. Even more bizarre was Dinochraceuta, an earlier giant hyena from the Miocene. Despite its name, which means terrible hyena, Dinochraceuta was not closely related to true hyenas. It belonged to a different evolutionary lineage, but convergent evolution had sculpted it into a similar ecological role. It had the same massive jaws, the same bone-crushing teeth, and the same scavenging lifestyle. The existence of multiple giant hyena lineages across different epochs shows just how successful this body plan was. If you could crush bone, if you could outlast the cats at a kill site, you could thrive. And the carnivore guild extended beyond the cats and hyenas. There were bear dogs, members of the extinct family Amphicyonidae, massive predators that combined the build of a bear with the hunting instincts of a wolf. These creatures could weigh over 600 pounds, making them larger than any modern carnivore. They were generalists, capable of hunting, scavenging, and defending their kills with ferocious aggression. Some species had long legs suited for running down prey on open ground. Others were heavily built ambush hunters. They were ecological Swiss Army knives, adapting to whatever niche the environment offered. There were also civets, mongooses, and early canids, smaller predators that filled the gaps left by the giants, hunting rodents, birds, and juvenile herbivores. The sheer density of carnivores in prehistoric Africa is difficult to comprehend. In modern ecosystems, there is a rough ratio of prey biomass to predator biomass, usually around 10 to 1. But in the Pliocene, the ratio seems to have been much tighter. The fossil assemblages show that carnivores were everywhere, overlapping in their hunting ranges, competing fiercely for every scrap of meat. This was not a balanced, harmonious ecosystem. It was a pressure cooker, a crucible where only the most efficient killers and scavengers could survive. The competition was so intense that it drove innovations. The saber-tooths evolved their specialized teeth not just to kill, but to kill quickly and move on before the hyenas arrived. The hyenas evolved their bone-crushing jaws not just to scavenge, but to dominate kill sites and extract nutrients that other predators could not access. The bear dogs evolved their size and versatility to compete with both groups. Every adaptation was an arms race, every evolutionary step a response to pressure from rivals. And then, into this gladiatorial arena, walked our ancestors. Early hominins like Australopithecus and later Homo erectus were small, relatively defenseless bipeds trying to carve out a niche in a world ruled by fangs and claws. The evidence suggests that early humans were not top predators. They were opportunists, scavengers who followed the carnivores, waiting for them to finish feeding before darting in, to crack open the leftover bones for marrow. Stone tools gave them an edge, a way to access calories that the hyenas and cats could not. But it was a dangerous living. The bones of early hominins found in caves show cut marks from stone tools, but also puncture marks from carnivore teeth. We were both the butchers and the butchered, caught in the middle of a food web that had no mercy for the weak. The carnivore guild of prehistoric Africa was not just diverse, it was redundant, layered, and utterly merciless. There was no safe place, no time of day when the threat of death was not present. The herbivores lived in a state of perpetual vigilance, and even the predators had to watch their backs, knowing that a rival could appear at any moment to challenge them for a kill. This was the ecosystem at its most raw, its most competitive, and its most beautiful in its terrible efficiency. It was a system that could only exist when prey was abundant, when the grasslands and woodlands teemed with giants, and when those giants began to fall, the whole edifice would come crashing down. The herbivores and carnivores of prehistoric Africa lived in a world that was not stable. While modern ecosystems experienced gradual seasonal changes, the Pliocene and Pleistocene were defined by violent oscillations in climate that swung between extremes with a speed and intensity that is difficult for us to imagine. These were not the gentle cycles of a temperate spring giving way to summer. These were planetary-scale convulsions driven by forces operating in the void of space, invisible hands that tilted the Earth on its axis and stretched its orbit into eccentric ellipses. And Africa, sitting astride the equator, felt every tremor. The primary driver of these climate swings was orbital mechanics. The Earth does not orbit the Sun in a perfect circle. Its path is an ellipse that changes shape over cycles lasting 100,000 years, a phenomenon known as eccentricity. At the same time, the tilt of Earth's axis wobbles like a spinning top losing momentum, shifting between 22 and 24 degrees over a cycle of 41,000 years. And the axis itself slowly rotates, tracing a circle in space over a period of 21,000 years, a motion called precession. These three cycles, eccentricity, obliquity, and precession, interact in complex ways to change the amount and distribution of sunlight, hitting different parts of the planet at different times of the year. When the cycles align in certain configurations, they can amplify or dampen seasonal contrasts, driving the Earth into ice ages or pulling it into warm interglacial periods. For Africa, particularly East Africa, the most important cycle was precession. Every 21,000 years or so, the timing of the Earth's closest approach to the Sun shifted relative to the seasons. When the Northern Hemisphere summer coincided with Earth's closest approach, the African monsoons intensified. Warm, moist air from the Indian Ocean surged inland, drenching the continent in rain. Lakes expanded, rivers overflowed their banks, the grasslands turned into lush savannas dotted with wetlands. Herbivores thrived, populations exploded. For a few thousand years, Africa was a paradise. But then the cycle shifted. The monsoons weakened, the rains failed. Drought set in, not for a season, but for centuries. Lakes dried up, leaving behind salt flats and cracked mud. Rivers shrank into chains of stagnant pools. The grasslands withered. The herbivores, which had multiplied during the wet phase, now faced a landscape stripped bare. Starvation became widespread. Populations crashed. The carnivores, which had grown fat on abundant prey, now found themselves in a dying world. Competition intensified. Only the most adaptable species survived. What made these swings particularly brutal in East Africa was the existence of a geological feature known as amplifier lakes. These are large, shallow, lakes that expand and contract dramatically in response to changes in rainfall. During wet periods, they flood vast areas, creating enormous freshwater ecosystems. During dry periods, they evaporate almost completely, leaving behind salt deserts. The East African Rift Valley is studded with these lakes: Turkana, Victoria, Tanganyika, each one a hydrological amplifier that magnified the effects of climate change. When the rains came, the lakes filled and spilled over, connecting into vast wetland systems. When the rains failed, they shrank, isolating populations and fragmenting habitats. The fossil record shows that these climate oscillations were not gentle. During the Middle Pleistocene, beginning around 1 million years ago, the oscillations intensified. Megadroughts, periods of extreme aridity lasting thousands of years, began to occur with increasing frequency. These droughts were so severe that they left scars in the geological record, layers of sediment choked with dust and, devoid of pollen, silent tombstones marking the collapse of entire ecosystems. The herbivores that survived these droughts were the ones that could migrate, that could follow the retreating water sources, or that could switch their diets to survive on whatever sparse vegetation remained. The specialists, the browsers that fed only on certain types of leaves, the grazers that depended on specific grasses, they vanished. And the climate did not just oscillate between wet and dry, it also swung between warm and cool. During glacial periods, when ice sheets advanced over the northern hemisphere, the global atmospheric circulation patterns shifted. The trade winds strengthened. The tropical rainforests of Central Africa contracted, fragmenting into isolated pockets. The savannas expanded, pushing into areas that had once been woodland. The temperature dropped, not drastically, but enough to stress the megafauna. Elephants and rhinos are warm-adapted animals. They have large bodies with relatively small surface areas, a design that conserves heat in cold climates, but can lead to overheating in hot ones. During glacial periods, they could thrive, but during interglacials, when temperatures soared, they faced heat stress and had to seek out water sources more frequently, making them vulnerable to predators and disease. The fossil pollen records from lake cores tell this story in exquisite detail. Scientists drilling into the sediments of ancient lake beds can extract tiny grains of pollen, each one a fingerprint of the plants that grew in the surrounding landscape when that layer of mud was deposited. By counting and identifying these grains, researchers can reconstruct the vegetation communities of the past with remarkable precision. During the wet phases of the precession cycle, the pollen shows an abundance of tree species, ferns, and moisture-loving plants. The landscape was greener, more wooded, more hospitable. During the dry phases, tree pollen declines, dramatically, replaced by grass pollen and the spores of drought-resistant shrubs. The landscape opened up, became harsher, more exposed to the elements. These shifts were not gradual transitions. They were sharp, sometimes occurring over the span of just a few centuries. Imagine being a browser, a creature whose entire evolutionary strategy is built around eating leaves from trees, and watching as the forests that have sustained your lineage for millions of years simply vanish, replaced by grasslands that offer nothing you can digest. You cannot evolve a new digestive system in a few generations. You cannot suddenly develop the teeth needed to process tough, fibrous grass. You can only move, following the retreating tree line into shrinking pockets of suitable habitat, or you can die. And when the suitable habitat is fragmented into isolated islands, separated by vast stretches of open grassland patrolled by predators, movement becomes a death sentence. The predators themselves were not immune to these oscillations. During the wet periods, when prey was abundant and widely distributed, carnivores could afford to be specialists. A saber-tooth could focus on hunting juvenile elephants, perfecting the techniques needed to bring down such massive prey. But during the dry periods, when prey became scarce and concentrated around the few remaining water sources, specialization became a liability. A carnivore that could only hunt one type of prey would starve when that prey disappeared. The generalists, the carnivores that could switch between hunting, scavenging, and eating smaller animals, had the advantage. This constant pressure toward flexibility, toward behavioral plasticity, shaped the carnivore guild over time, weeding out the extreme specialists and favoring the adaptable. But there was a limit to adaptability. The megafauna were large, and large animals are constrained by physics. They need enormous amounts of food to sustain their body mass. They have long lifespans and slow reproductive rates. They cannot rapidly adjust their populations to match fluctuating resources. When the environment swings from abundance to scarcity, a mega herbivore cannot simply produce more offspring to take advantage of the good times, and it cannot reduce its population size quickly enough to avoid overgrazing when the bad times hit. This lag between environmental change and biological response creates instability, a wobble in the system that grows more pronounced with each oscillation, until eventually the system breaks. The variability itself became a selection pressure. Species that could only tolerate a narrow range of conditions that needed a specific climate to reproduce were weeded out. What remained were the generalists, the adaptable, the survivors who could endure both feast and famine, flood and drought, heat and cold. This constant environmental churning acted like a crucible, forging resilience but also driving extinctions. Every climatic swing was a lottery. Some lineages won, most lost. And over millions of years, the cumulative effect was the erosion of diversity, the slow but relentless simplification of the once rich tapestry of African megafauna. The climate was not a stable stage on which evolution played out. It was an active participant, a chaotic, unpredictable force that shaped the players themselves. The Africa we see today, with its relatively modest fauna and simplified ecosystems, is the product of millions of years of climatic whiplash. The giants that once roamed here were tested again and again, and eventually most of them failed the test. The grasslands that replaced the forests were not gentler. They were harsher, more variable, more demanding, and only the toughest, the most flexible, the most ruthless could call them home. Into this maelstrom of shifting climates, competing carnivores, and struggling herbivores, a new player emerged. Hominins, our ancestors, were not passive observers of this drama. They were participants, shaped by the same forces that sculpted the saber-tooths and the giant hyenas, and eventually becoming forces themselves, capable of altering the very ecosystems that birthed them. But in the beginning, they were small, vulnerable, and utterly unremarkable. The story of human evolution in prehistoric Africa is not a story of inevitable triumph. It is a story of survival against overwhelming odds, of clinging to the margins of a world that had no interest in making room for a bipedal ape with delusions of grandeur. The earliest hominins, species like Sahelanthropus and Ardipithecus, lived in the transitional woodlands of the late Miocene and early Pliocene, between 7 and 4 million years ago. They were still heavily adapted to life in the trees, with grasping feet and long arms suited for climbing. But they had also evolved a curious trait: bipedalism, the ability to walk upright on two legs. Why this adaptation emerged is still debated. It may have been an energy-efficient way to move between scattered food sources in a fragmenting forest landscape. It may have allowed early hominins to see over tall grass and spot predators or food from a distance. It may have freed the hands for carrying tools, food, or infants. Whatever the reason, bipedalism was the first step down a path that would eventually lead to us. By 3 million years ago, the genus Australopithecus had emerged, a diverse group of hominins that combined ape-like features with increasingly human traits. They were small, standing only about 1.2 meters tall, and their brains were barely larger than those of modern chimpanzees. They lived in the mosaic landscapes of East and South Africa, habitats that mixed woodland patches with open grassland. They were omnivores, eating fruits, leaves, tubers, and occasional small animals or scavenged meat. But they were not predators. The fossil evidence is clear. Australopithecus was prey. Bones from sites like Taung in South Africa and Sterkfontein show puncture marks consistent with the bite of the large carnivores, particularly leopards and eagles. The famous Taung child skull, discovered in the 1920s, bears the telltale damage of a raptor strike, evidence that even our direct ancestors were being plucked from the landscape and carried off to nests to feed hungry chicks. The world these early hominins inhabited was one where death was omnipresent. They did not have claws or fangs. They could not outrun a saber-tooth or fight off a pack of hyenas. Their survival depended on vigilance, on living in social groups where many eyes could watch for danger, and on exploiting ecological niches that the larger predators ignored. They were edge-dwellers, creatures of the twilight zone between the forest and the grassland, too terrestrial to live entirely in the trees but too defenseless to venture far into the open plains. Their world was circumscribed by fear, their movements dictated by the rhythms of the predators that shared their landscape. Archaeological evidence from this period is sparse, but what exists paints a picture of profound vulnerability. The fossil sites that preserve hominin remains are often caves, dark limestone chambers that offered shelter but also served as death traps. Cave deposits from South Africa contain the bones of hundreds of baboons, alongside those of early hominins, all bearing the same telltale marks of predation. These were not burial sites. They were larders, accumulation points where leopards and other predators dragged their kills to feed in safety, away from scavengers. Our ancestors were being cached like any other prey animal, their bodies left to rot in the dark alongside the remains of antelopes and pigs. The realization that early hominins were prey, not predators, fundamentally changed our understanding of human evolution. For decades, the narrative was one of the mighty hunter, the brave hominin striding across the savannah with a spear, bringing down game and dominating the landscape. But the evidence does not support this story, not for the early stages of our evolution. Australopithecus did not have spears. They had sticks and stones, crude tools useful for digging up tubers or cracking nuts, but utterly inadequate for defending against a charging carnivore. They were small, probably weighing no more than 40 kilograms, about the size of a modern chimpanzee. They were weak by the standards of the megafauna, and they were numerous enough to be worth hunting, a common enough feature of the landscape that predators incorporated them into their regular diet. This predation pressure shaped our psychology in ways that still linger. The fear of the dark, the instinctive dread that grips us when we hear an unexpected noise in the night, is not a cultural construct. It is an evolutionary vestige, a survival mechanism honed over millions of years when darkness meant death. Hominins were diurnal, creatures, active during the day when their vision gave them an advantage. But night belonged to the predators. The cats, with their superior night vision and silent stalking, ruled the hours after sunset. Early hominins would have huddled together in trees or rocky shelters, listening to the sounds of the hunt unfolding around them, the roar of a lion, the shriek of a dying zebra, the crunch of bones as hyenas fed. Sleep was a dangerous necessity, a window of vulnerability when a predator could approach undetected. Those who slept too deeply, who failed to wake at the sound of a twig snapping, did not pass on their genes. Social behaviour, the tendency to form tight-knit groups and cooperate with kin and non-kin alike, also has its roots in this era of vulnerability. A solitary hominin was a dead hominin. But a group of 10 or 20 individuals, all alert, all capable of raising an alarm, had a fighting chance. The evolutionary psychologists call this the many eyes hypothesis. Predators are ambush hunters. They rely on stealth and surprise. If their approach is detected early, the element of surprise is lost and the hunt often fails. By living in groups, early hominins multiplied their sensory reach. Someone was always watching, always listening, and when danger was spotted, the alarm could be sounded, giving the group time to flee to safety, to climb trees, or to form a defensive huddle with the vulnerable young and old protected in the centre. But groups are not free. They require communication, cooperation, and the ability to resolve conflicts without violence. A group that constantly fought internally would be too distracted to watch for external threats. This pressure to get along, to form alliances, to negotiate and compromise, drove the evolution of our social brains. The prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for decision-making, impulse control and social reasoning, began to expand. Language, or at least proto-language, a system of calls and gestures more complex than those of other primates, likely emerged during this period. The ability to communicate about absent things, to warn of a predator seen earlier in the day, to coordinate a group movement toward a distant food source, was a game-changer. It allowed hominins to share information, to plan, to build a collective knowledge base that no individual could possess alone. Then, around 2 million years ago, something shifted. The genus Homo appeared, marked by a significant increase in brain size and a shift in diet. Homo erectus, the first truly widespread hominin species, had a brain nearly twice the size of Australopithecus. This expansion was fueled by a change in behaviour. They became more carnivorous. Stone tools, which had existed in simple flake form for hundreds of thousands of years, became more sophisticated. The Apuleian hand axe, a teardrop-shaped tool with sharp edges on both sides, appeared. These tools were not just for cracking nuts, they were for butchery, for slicing through the tough hides of dead megafauna and accessing the rich, calorie-dense meat and marrow inside. But Homo erectus was not a mighty hunter striding across the plains with spears. The evidence suggests a far more desperate and opportunistic lifestyle. They were scavengers, followers of the true predators. When a saber-tooth made a kill and fed until it was sated, it would often leave the carcass behind, moving off to rest in the shade. The hyenas would arrive next, cracking bones and tearing at the remaining flesh. And then, when the hyenas had moved on, the hominins would creep in. They would use their stone tools to access the parts of the carcass that the carnivores could not reach, splitting long bones to extract marrow, peeling back hides to get at scraps of meat clinging to the ribs. It was dangerous work. A lingering carnivore could return at any moment. A rival hominin group might arrive to contest the prize. And always there was the risk of disease from rotting flesh. The isotopic analysis of hominin teeth tells us that by 1.5 million years ago, meat made up a significant portion of the Homo erectus diet. But the cut marks on fossil bones also tell another story. Many of these bones bear two sets of marks, carnivore tooth marks overlaid with stone tool cut marks. This suggests that hominins were often arriving at carcasses after the predators had already fed, a clear sign of their subordinate position in the food web. They were not apex predators. They were opportunists, exploiting a niche that no other animal had fully tapped, the role of the tool-using scavenger. This lifestyle had consequences. It forced early humans into direct competition with the carnivore guild. They were stealing food from hyenas and saber-tooths, even if only the scraps. This competition may have driven several of the predator extinctions. As hominins became more efficient at processing carcasses, they may have reduced the available carrion for scavengers like Pachyrhinacuta, contributing to their decline. But the reverse was also true. The presence of so many large predators shaped human evolution, selecting for intelligence, social cooperation, and technological innovation. Our ancestors had to be smart to survive. They had to communicate, to plan, to work together to defend a carcass, or to flee when a carnivore approached. There is a long-standing hypothesis that early humans, specifically Homo erectus, played a role in the decline of African megafauna through overhunting. But the fossil evidence does not support this. The megaherbivore extinctions began around 4.6 million years ago, long before Homo erectus appeared. And even after Homo erectus evolved, the extinctions continued gradually over millions of years, not in a sudden wave of overkill. The stone tools of early humans were crude. Killing a full-grown elephant or rhino with a hand axe would have been suicidal. These animals were simply too large, too powerful, too dangerous. Hominins may have occasionally killed juveniles or attacked weakened individuals, but they were not driving entire species to extinction through hunting pressure. Instead, the evidence points to climate change as the primary driver of megafaunal decline, with hominins playing a secondary opportunistic role. As the grasslands expanded and the climate oscillated, herbivore diversity fell, and as the herbivores declined, the carnivores that depended on them, including the saber-tooths and giant hyenas, also began to disappear. Homo erectus was navigating a collapsing ecosystem, adapting to the changes rather than causing them. They were survivors, not destroyers, at least not yet. The age of human-driven extinctions would come much later, in the terminal Pleistocene, when our species, Homo sapiens, armed with advanced weapons and sophisticated hunting strategies, would spread across the globe and finish the job that climate change had started. For millions of years, the hominins of Africa were just another species trying to make it in a brutal world. They were clever, yes, and adaptable, but they were not masters of their environment. They were shaped by the same forces that shaped the elephants and the lions, the same droughts and floods, the same predators and diseases. They evolved in the shadow of giants, and that shadow left its mark on our psychology, our social structures, our very DNA. The fear of the dark, the instinct to huddle together at night, the thrill of the hunt and the terror of being hunted, these are not abstract concepts. They are echoes of a time when our ancestors lived every day on the edge of survival, in an ecosystem that was, quite literally, the most ruthless the planet had ever seen. And then, in what seems like a geological instant, the giants began to fall. The terminal Pleistocene, the period between 13,000 and 6,000 years ago, witnessed the final collapse of the megafaunal community that had dominated Africa for millions of years. It was not a single catastrophic event, no asteroid strike or volcanic super eruption. It was a slow, grinding attrition, a hemorrhage of species that accelerated as the world warmed and the ice sheets of the northern hemisphere retreated. By the time the dust settled and the Holocene, our current geological epoch, began, 28 lineages of megaherbivores had vanished from the African fossil record. The age of giants was over, and in its wake lay a diminished, simplified world. The extinctions were not random. They followed a pattern. Grazers, animals that fed primarily on grass, were hit harder than browsers. Species that were specialists, adapted to narrow environmental niches, died out, while generalists survived. Large-bodied animals, those over 1,000 kilograms, suffered disproportionately. And the extinctions were concentrated in the terminal Pleistocene and early Holocene, a relatively narrow window of time when the global climate was undergoing rapid change. The Ice Age was ending, temperatures were rising, rainfall patterns were shifting, and the megafauna, which had already been stressed by millions of years of climate oscillations, could not adapt fast enough. The evidence for the timing of these extinctions comes from radiocarbon dating of fossil bones. In Africa, unlike in the Americas or Australia, the megafaunal collapse was not synchronized with the arrival of anatomically modern humans. Humans had been in Africa for hundreds of thousands of years, living alongside the megafauna without causing mass extinctions. This suggests that the terminal Pleistocene extinctions were driven primarily by environmental change, not by human hunting. The climate was the executioner. Humans were merely the witnesses. What made the terminal Pleistocene so deadly was not just the warming itself, but the speed of the change. The transition from the last glacial maximum, the coldest point of the Ice Age around 21,000 years ago, to the warm Holocene occurred over the span of just 10,000 years. For a mega herbivore with a long generation time, slow reproduction, and specific habitat requirements, this was far too fast. Elephants, for example, take years to reach sexual maturity and give birth to a single calf after a gestation period of nearly 2 years. They cannot rapidly increase their population to exploit new habitats or replace losses from environmental stress. When their food sources collapse, they cannot evolve or migrate fast enough to survive. The grasslands themselves were changing. As the climate warmed, the types of grasses that grew on the African savannas shifted. C4 grasses, which had dominated during the cooler, more arid glacial periods, began to give way to different vegetation. Wetlands expanded in some areas, transforming former grasslands into swamps unsuitable for grazing megafauna. Forests encroached in other regions, fragmenting the open habitats. The mosaic of environments that had allowed such high diversity to coexist was breaking apart. Each species was left stranded in shrinking pockets of suitable habitat, isolated populations dwindling until they crossed the threshold of genetic viability and winked out. And as the herbivores fell, the carnivores followed. The saber-tooths, which had specialized in taking down large prey, found their food sources evaporating. Meganterion, Dinophilis, and Homotherium all went extinct in Africa by the end of the Pleistocene. The giant hyenas, which had depended on abundant carcasses to scavenge, also disappeared. Pachyrhikuta vanished from the fossil record. The bear dogs, already rare by the late Pleistocene, were gone. The carnivore guild, which had been one of the most diverse on the planet, collapsed into the simplified assemblage we see today. Lions, leopards, cheetahs, spotted hyenas, and a handful of smaller predators. It is a functional ecosystem, but it is a shadow of what existed before. The extinctions were not absolute. Africa retained more of its megafauna than any other continent. When humans spread into the Americas, Australia, and the islands of the Pacific, they triggered catastrophic extinction events. In North America, all the mammoths, mastodons, saber-tooths, dire wolves, giant ground sloths and glyptodonts vanished. In Australia, the giant marsupials, the diprotodonts and the massive flightless birds were wiped out. But Africa, where humans had evolved and where the fauna had co-evolved with our ancestors for millions of years, suffered less. The large herbivores and predators that survived were the ones that had learned to avoid humans, that had evolved a healthy fear of the bipedal ape with the throwing arm and the sharp tools. Africa's megafauna was not naive. It had been dealing with hominins for millennia, and that experience conferred a survival advantage. But survival does not mean thriving. The 5 megaherbivores that remain today, the African bush elephant, the African forest elephant, the white rhinoceros, the black rhinoceros, and the hippopotamus, are embattled remnants clinging to existence in protected reserves and fragmented habitats. Their ranges have shrunk to a fraction of what they once were. Their populations are a tiny percentage of their prehistoric abundance. The Serengeti, often held up as the last great wilderness, hosts only a fraction of the biomass and diversity that existed during the Pliocene. The modern African ecosystem is not a pristine relic. It is a survivor, scarred and depleted, a living memorial to the giants that came before. The great dying of the terminal Pleistocene teaches us a sobering lesson. Extinction is not always dramatic. It does not always arrive with a bang. Sometimes it comes as a slow fade, a gradual erosion of populations, a quiet disappearance of species that once seemed invincible. The megafauna of Africa endured for millions of years, weathering countless climate cycles, adapting to new predators and changing landscapes. But in the end, they could not adapt fast enough to the final pulse of warming, the final shift in vegetation, the final contraction of their habitats. They were not weak. They were not failures. They were simply too large, too slow to reproduce, too specialized to survive in a world that was changing faster than evolution could respond. And we, the last survivors of the hominin lineage, are left to walk among the ghosts. We inherit a world that is emptier, quieter, less wild than the one our ancestors knew, and we carry the responsibility, whether we accept it or not, to preserve what remains, to ensure that the last elephants and rhinos do not follow the saber-tooths and giant hyenas into the fossil record. Because once they are gone forever. and the world will be diminished in ways we cannot measure. If you stand in the Serengeti today, in the golden light of dawn, and watch a herd of elephants moving across the grassland, it is easy to imagine that you are seeing nature as it has always been. The lions are resting in the shade, the giraffes are browsing from the trees, the wildebeest are grazing in vast herds. It looks complete, it looks whole. But you're looking at a stage where most of the actors have already left. You're watching a play that has been running for millions of years, but now only the final act remains, and most of the cast is missing. Prehistoric Africa was a theatre of giants. It was a world where 3 species of elephants shared the same waterhole, where rhinos of different lineages browsed side by side, where saber-toothed cats stalked through the twilight and giant hyenas dragged bones into caves that would become fossil treasures millions of years later. It was a world of density, of biomass, of competition so fierce that every adaptation was honed to perfection and every misstep was fatal. The herbivores were not just large, they were specialised, each one filling a unique niche, each one contributing to the functioning of the ecosystem in ways we're only beginning to understand. The mega herbivores were ecological engineers. They shaped the landscape. Elephants, with their habit of pushing over trees and stripping bark, prevented forests from encroaching on the grasslands. They maintained the open savannas, creating habitat for grazers. Rhinos, with their wallowing, created water sources and mud baths that other animals depended on. Hippos, with their nocturnal grazing and daytime defecation in rivers, transferred nutrients from the land to the water, fertilizing aquatic ecosystems. The loss of these animals did not just mean fewer elephants, it meant a fundamental change in how the ecosystem functioned. The grasslands became woodier, the nutrient cycles slowed, the landscape became less dynamic, less productive, less capable of supporting the diversity it once held. And when the herbivores declined, the carnivores declined with them. The loss of the saber-tooths was not just the loss of a predator, it was the loss of an evolutionary strategy, a lineage that had dominated the planet for millions of years. The saber-tooths were specialists in killing megafauna, and when the megafauna disappeared, there was no longer a niche for them. The giant hyenas, which had relied on abundant carcasses, also vanished. The ecosystem simplified, became less complex, less interconnected. Fewer species meant fewer interactions, fewer feedback loops, a less resilient system overall. We often talk about rewilding, about restoring ecosystems to some imagined pristine state. But what state? The Serengeti of today is not the Serengeti of 10,000 years ago, which was not the Serengeti of 1 million years ago. Ecosystems are not static, they are constantly changing, constantly evolving. But the rate of change we are witnessing today, driven by human activity, is orders of magnitude faster than anything in the fossil record except for mass extinction events. We are not just losing species, we are losing the time for new species to evolve, to fill the empty niches, to restore the complexity. Evolution operates on timescales of millions of years. We are making changes on timescales of decades. The story of prehistoric Africa is a story of resilience and fragility. The megafauna survived for millions of years, adapting to climate swings that would have wiped out less robust lineages. But in the end, they were vulnerable to a change that came too fast, a warming that pushed them beyond their limits. And we, who evolved in the shadow of these giants, who were shaped by the same forces that shaped them, now live in a world that is poorer for their absence. We look at the Serengeti and see wilderness, but it is a diminished wilderness, a ghost of what once was. As you settle into sleep tonight, let your mind drift back through those millions of years. Imagine standing in a Pliocene forest surrounded by the calls of animals that no longer exist. Imagine the ground shaking as a herd of Dinotherium moves through the underbrush, their downward curving tusks scraping the bark from ancient trees. Imagine the twilight, when the saber-tooths begin their hunt, and the giant hyenas gather at the edge of a kill, waiting for their turn. Imagine the terror and the beauty, the violence and the grace, the sheer overwhelming abundance of life in a world where giants walked. That world is gone now. The forests have turned to grasslands. The grasslands have been fragmented by roads and farms. The megafauna have been reduced to a handful of survivors, but the story is not over. The elephants are still here. The rhinos, though critically endangered, still roam. The lions still hunt. And as long as they remain, there is a thread of continuity, a living connection to that ancient, ruthless, magnificent world. Close your eyes. Let the sounds of the modern world fade. Listen instead to the wind over the savannah, the distant roar of a lion, the low rumble of elephants communicating across miles of open ground. You are safe, you are warm, and somewhere, in the wild places that remain, the last echoes of prehistoric Africa still endure, a reminder that life, for all its brutality, is also resilient, adaptable, and endlessly creative. Sleep well. The giants may be gone, but their legacy lives on in the bones beneath the earth and in the stories we tell about the world that was, and perhaps, if we choose wisely, the world that could be again, moving from beings who could make tools and control fire to beings who could create meaning, who could externalize their inner mental worlds through art and symbol, who could pass down knowledge not just through demonstration but through stories and songs. But even as humans flourished in the old world, the greatest challenges and the most extraordinary journeys still lay ahead. The Americas and the remote islands of the Pacific remained unpopulated by humans. These final frontiers would require not just walking, but navigating open oceans and crossing frozen wastelands, pushing the limits of human endurance and ingenuity to their breaking point. The route into the Americas was blocked for much of the late Pleistocene by an insurmountable barrier: the Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets, vast glaciers that covered all of Canada and extended south into what is now the northern United States. But around 16 to 15,000 years ago, as the climate began to warm and the Ice Age loosened its grip, corridors began to open. One ran along the western coast of North America, between the retreating glaciers and the Pacific Ocean. Another was an interior route between the two major ice sheets. Exactly which route the first Americans took, or whether they used both, remains uncertain, but archaeological evidence makes clear that by 15,000 years ago, humans had reached the southern tip of South America, a distance of more than 15,000 kilometers from Beringia, the land bridge that connected Siberia and Alaska during times of the low sea level. The speed of this expansion is breathtaking. To travel from Alaska to Patagonia in just a few thousand years required not just mobility, but incredible adaptability. The migrants passed through every climate zone on Earth, from Arctic tundra to temperate forests, from high mountain plateaus to tropical rainforests, from deserts to wetlands. Each environment required different survival strategies, different technologies, different knowledge. And unlike the gradual expansions across the Old World, which took place over tens of thousands of years, allowing time for biological and cultural adaptation, the colonization of the Americas was rapid, almost explosive. These people were not slowly evolving to fit new niches. They were using culture, knowledge, and technology to make themselves fit, creating the tools and strategies needed to survive wherever they found themselves. The Americas they entered were a megafaunal paradise, a land of giants unlike anything that exists today. Mammoths and mastodons, relatives of modern elephants but covered in thick woolly coats, roamed in vast herds across the grasslands and forests. Ground sloths, some species weighing several tons and standing as tall as a giraffe when rearing on their hind legs, browsed from trees and stripped vegetation with massive claws. Glyptodonts, armored mammals the size of small cars with domed shells and spiked tails, grazed on grasses like oversized armadillos. Giant beavers, as large as modern black bears, built dams and lodges in the rivers of North America. Short-faced bears, towering predators with long legs built for running, hunted across the open plains. Saber-toothed cats, dire wolves, American lions, and scimitar cats formed a guild of predators as diverse and dangerous as anything that existed in prehistoric Africa. The arrival of humans in the Americas coincided with a massive extinction event. The megafauna, the giant mammals that had dominated the continents for millions of years, began to disappear. Mammoths and mastodons, ground sloths the size of elephants, Giant beavers, saber-toothed cats, dire wolves, short-faced bears, all vanished within a few thousand years of human arrival. The cause of this extinction is hotly debated. Climate change was certainly occurring. The end of the Ice Age brought dramatic shifts in vegetation and rainfall patterns. But the timing is suspicious. The extinctions followed the wave of human expansion from north to south, and the pattern is consistent with overkill, human hunting pressure on naive populations of large animals that had never encountered human predators before. The overkill hypothesis, first proposed by paleontologist Paul Martin in the 1960s, argues that human hunters, armed with effective weapons and cooperative hunting strategies, could drive prey species to extinction within centuries. The megafauna of the Americas, having evolved in the absence of human predators, would have lacked the behavioural adaptations that African and Eurasian megafauna had developed over millions of years of coexistence with hominins. An African elephant that sees a human knows to be wary, to keep its distance, to protect its young. This wariness is not instinctive but learned, passed down through generations, a cultural knowledge maintained in elephant societies through teaching and memory. But an American mammoth had never seen a human. It would have had no reason to flee, no understanding that these small bipedal creatures were dangerous. The first encounter might have been curious rather than fearful, and by the time the mammoths learned to fear humans, it was too late. Their populations were too small, too fragmented to recover. The archaeological evidence for overkill is mixed. Kill sites, locations where human hunters butchered megafauna, are relatively rare. The most famous is the Clovis culture, named after a distinctive style of stone projectile point found across North America, dating to between 13,000 and 13,500 years ago. Clovis points are beautifully made, fluted spear tips that fit securely into wooden shafts and could be thrust or thrown with considerable force. At several sites, Clovis points have been found embedded in mammoth bones or lying among the scattered remains of butchered animals, clear evidence that humans were hunting these giants. But whether hunting alone could drive extinctions is debated. Computer models of megafaunal population dynamics suggest that even low levels of hunting, taking only a small percentage of the population each year, could be enough to tip slowly reproducing species into terminal decline. Mammoths, like modern elephants, had long generation times, taking decades to reach sexual maturity and giving birth to a single calf after a gestation period of nearly 2 years. If human hunters preferentially targeted juveniles and young adults, the easiest and least dangerous prey, they could have disrupted the age structure of mammoth populations, removing the individuals who would have been the breeders of the next generation. Even a small reduction in recruitment, the number of young reaching adulthood each year, sustained over decades, would have compounded into population collapse. Other researchers point to climate change as the primary driver, with human hunting playing a secondary role. The end of the Pleistocene brought rapid warming, causing vegetation zones to shift. The mammoth steppe, a unique ecosystem of cold-adapted grasses that supported vast herds of megaherbivores, began to fragment and disappear, replaced by forests in some areas and tundra or desert in others. As the habitat shrank, megafaunal populations declined simply due to loss of food and living space. Humans may have delivered the final blow, pushing already stressed populations over the edge, but the underlying cause was environmental change beyond any one species' control. The truth is probably a combination of both factors. Climate change and human hunting acted synergistically, each amplifying the effects of the other. A population stressed by habitat loss is more vulnerable to hunting pressure. Conversely, a population already reduced by hunting has less genetic diversity and less ability to adapt to changing environments. Together, these pressures created a perfect storm of extinction that swept across the Americas, removing almost all of the megafauna within a geological instant. Within a remarkably short time, the megafauna were gone and the Americas were transformed. The ecosystems that had been shaped by these giant herbivores and the predators that hunted them collapsed and reorganized. Grasslands that had been maintained by mammoth grazing became forests. Seed dispersal systems that had relied on mastodons eating fruits and defecating the seeds miles away broke down, causing some plant species to decline or shift their ranges. The removal of the megafauna was not just a loss of charismatic species, it was a fundamental restructuring of the ecological order, and humans, whether intentionally or not, were the primary architects of that change. While the Americas were being settled, another extraordinary chapter of human expansion was unfolding in the Pacific. The islands of Oceania, scattered across millions of square kilometres of open ocean, represented a challenge unlike any humans had faced before. The Australian continent and New Guinea had been reached tens of thousands of years earlier by short ocean crossings from Southeast Asia. But the islands of Polynesia, Micronesia and Melanesia lay thousands of kilometres from the nearest land masses, separated by vast stretches of water with no intervening islands, no visible landmarks, and no guarantee that land existed at all in the direction one was sailing. The settlement of the Pacific required sophisticated maritime technology. The Austronesian peoples, originating from Taiwan and the Philippines around 5,000 years ago, developed outrigger canoes capable of long-distance voyaging, double-hulled vessels that could carry families' supplies and even livestock across open ocean. They became master navigators, reading the stars, the swells, the flight patterns of birds, and the colour of the water to find their way across the trackless sea. They carried with them a package of crops, taro, yams, breadfruit and animals, pigs, chickens and dogs, creating portable ecosystems that could be established on uninhabited islands. The navigation techniques these voyagers developed were extraordinary, a complex body of knowledge passed down through generations, encoded in chants, stories, and practical training that began in childhood. But the story does not end there. What follows is perhaps an even more remarkable chapter, a transformation that would reshape not just one continent but the entire planet. Because the stage we have explored, whether filled with ancient giants or dominated by shifting climates, whether ruled by fierce predators or shaped by geological forces, was merely the prologue. The real odyssey was about to begin, and it would be driven not by the largest animals or the most fearsome hunters, but by one small, adaptable, utterly unremarkable primate that refused to stay in one place. This is the story of the Great Dispersal, the moment when a single species stepped out of familiar territory and walked into the unknown, crossing deserts and oceans, mountains and ice sheets, until there was nowhere left to go. This is the story of how we became everywhere. Around 100,000 years ago, something began to shift in the behaviour of Homo sapiens living in East Africa. The archaeological record shows a subtle but profound change in the material culture, the objects left behind by these early humans. Stone tools became more sophisticated, not just functional, but refined, showing evidence of planning and foresight. Beads appeared, crafted from shells carried from distant coasts, suggesting not just aesthetic awareness but trade networks spanning hundreds of kilometres. Ochre, a red mineral pigment, was being ground into powder and used for purposes we can only guess at: body decoration, ceremonial marking, or symbolic communication. These were not the artifacts of animals simply trying to survive. These were the creations of minds capable of abstraction, of thinking beyond the immediate moment, of imagining possibilities that did not yet exist. The climate at this time was entering a phase of extreme instability. The world was caught in the grip of an ice age, but not a uniform one. The glacial cycles that dominated the Pleistocene were driven by subtle wobbles in Earth's orbit, changes so small that an individual human would never notice them in a lifetime, but powerful enough over millennia to freeze continents or melt polar ice. Africa, sitting astride the equator, did not experience the crushing ice sheets that buried Europe and North America, but it felt the secondary effects. The monsoon rains that watered the Sahel and the Ethiopian highlands weakened. Lakes shrank. Rivers dried to chains of stagnant pools. The grasslands that had supported vast herds of game animals withered, turning to dust. For the humans living there, the world was becoming increasingly hostile, less able to support the growing populations that had thrived during wetter times. This environmental pressure created a crisis, but also an opportunity. Populations faced a choice. They could stay and compete for dwindling resources, fighting over the last waterholes and the last herds, or they could move. For most of human evolutionary history, movement had been limited. Seasonal migrations following game or water, but always returning to familiar territories. But now, some groups made a different decision. They walked toward the horizon and kept walking, crossing into lands where no human foot had trodden before, carrying with them not just their tools and their children, but the accumulated knowledge of generations, the stories of how to find water, how to read the tracks of animals, how to survive. The first attempts to leave Africa may have begun as early as 200,000 years ago. Fossils from caves in the Levant, the region we now call Israel and Lebanon, show that Homo sapiens reached these areas and lived there intermittently for tens of thousands of years. These were not sustained migrations, but experimental forays, pioneering populations pushing into new territory during favourable climatic windows when the deserts bloomed and the routes north were passable. But these early ventures seem to have failed. The populations either died out or retreated back to Africa when conditions worsened, replaced by Neanderthals moving south from Europe, fleeing the advancing ice sheets of their own glacial nightmare. But humans are persistent creatures. The failures of the past did not erase the impulse to explore, the restlessness that seems wired into our species. Around 70 to 60,000 years ago, during a period when global climates were particularly harsh and northern Africa was locked in megadrought, something remarkable happened. A small group, perhaps numbering fewer than 1,000 individuals, left the Horn of Africa and crossed the narrow strait at Bab el-Mandeb, the Gate of Grief, where the Red Sea pinches close to the Arabian Peninsula. This was not a planned expedition. They were not explorers seeking glory or adventure. They were refugees, driven by necessity, following the coastline in search of food, exploiting the shellfish beds and tidal pools that required no sophisticated hunting skills, just patience and knowledge of the tides. This crossing, this single event involving perhaps a few hundred people at most, was the genetic bottleneck through which all non-African humanity would pass. Every person living today whose ancestors came from Europe, Asia, Australia, or the Americas can trace their lineage back to this one small group. They carried with them only a subset of the genetic diversity present in Africa, a sampling of alleles and traits that would become the foundation for all future populations outside the continent. This is why genetic studies consistently show that African populations are the most diverse, harbouring more genetic variation than all other human populations combined. The rest of us are the descendants of a splinter group, a breakaway faction that stumbled into the rest of the world. What they found on the other side of that strait was a landscape utterly unlike the one they had left. The Arabian Peninsula, today a scorching desert of sand and rock, was during this period transformed by the same orbital mechanics that had dried out Africa. The monsoons that had weakened over the Horn had strengthened over Arabia, turning the interior into a patchwork of grasslands dotted with freshwater lakes. Fossil lakes, their dried beds filled with the bones of hippos and water birds, tell us that this region was lush, a corridor of green threading between the mountains and the sea. The humans who arrived here would have found herds of oryx and gazelle, ostriches and wild cattle, a familiar savanna ecosystem transplanted into a foreign land. But this green corridor was temporary, a window that would close as the climate shifted again. The humans who had entered Arabia faced another decision. They could stay and risk being trapped when the rains failed and the desert returned, or they could keep moving, and move they did, following the coast eastward along the shores of the Persian Gulf, which during times of a low sea level was not a gulford, all but a river valley flanked by extensive floodplains. They walked through landscapes that are now submerged beneath hundreds of feet of water, archaeological sites lost forever beneath the waves, evidence of their passage drowned by the rising seas that came when the ice sheets melted. The coastal route took them into South Asia, reaching India perhaps as early as 70,000 years ago. Stone tools found in the Jureru Valley and other sites show technological signatures consistent with African Middle Stone Age traditions, the toolkit these migrants carried with them. From India, the expansion continued, accelerating along the tropical coasts of Southeast Asia. This was beachcombing on a continental scale, a strategy that required little adaptation. The coastline provided a predictable food source: shellfish and crabs, fish trapped in tidal pools, seabirds and their eggs. It was a marginal existence compared to the big game hunting of the African savannas, but it was reliable, and it allowed populations to leapfrog from one coastal ecosystem to the next without having to penetrate the dense, unfamiliar rainforests of the interior. The coastal migration strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. Coastlines are linear environments, one-dimensional corridors threading through otherwise hostile terrain. You can walk along a beach for 1,000 kilometers and encounter essentially the same ecosystem, the same food sources, the same dangers, the same survival challenges repeated endlessly. There is no need to learn new skills or develop new technologies. The knowledge that allowed you to survive on one stretch of coast would work just as well on the next. And the coast itself acts as a highway, a natural navigation system that requires no map. Keep the ocean on one side and you cannot get lost. Follow the shore and eventually you will reach somewhere new. Archaeological evidence for this coastal migration is frustratingly sparse, but the reason is obvious. Sea levels at the end of the Pleistocene were 100 to 120 meters lower than they are today. The coastlines where these early humans walked, the beaches where they gathered shellfish, the campsites where they built their fires, all of these are now underwater, submerged beneath the continental shelves. The archaeological sites that would prove the coastal migration hypothesis are drowned, buried under sediments deposited over the last 10,000 years of rising seas. We can only glimpse this lost world through scattered sites that happen to be inland from the ancient coasts, or through rare locations where tectonic uplift has raised ancient shorelines above the modern sea level, preserving them from the flood. But genetics fills in the gaps left by archaeology. The DNA of living populations tells a story of rapid coastal expansion. The genetic diversity of populations decreases as you move east from Africa, a pattern consistent with serial founder effects, where each new population established along the route carried only a subset of the genetic variation from the population that spawned it. This creates a gradient, a genetic trail of breadcrumbs leading from East Africa through Arabia, into India, and on through Southeast Asia to Australia. The molecular clock, the steady accumulation of mutations over time, allows geneticists to estimate when populations split from each other, and these dates align with the archaeological evidence for rapid coastal migration beginning around 70,000 years ago. The humans moving along these coasts were not travelling in a single wave. The migration was a diffusion process, populations expanding into empty territory, growing until they exceeded the carrying capacity of their local environment, and then fissioning, with some groups staying and others moving on. Over generations, this process led to the gradual filling of the coastal corridor, a string of settlements like beads on a necklace, each one separated from the next by a few days' walk. These settlements were not permanent villages. The people were still hunter-gatherers, still mobile, moving seasonally to exploit different resources, but they were tied to the coast, to the reliable abundance of marine foods that allowed them to maintain stable populations in environments where the terrestrial resources were unpredictable or difficult to access. By 60,000 years ago, humans had reached Sundaland, the vast shelf of land that connected the islands of Indonesia and Malaysia into a single continuous landmass during periods of low sea level. And here, for the first time, they encountered a barrier that could not be walked around. Between Sundaland and Sahul, the combined landmass of Australia and New Guinea, lay a stretch of open ocean, a gap that even at its narrowest during the lowest sea levels remained at least 90 kilometres wide. There was no visible land on the other side, no smoke from fires or birds flying to and from distant shores to indicate that something lay beyond the horizon. To cross this gap required boats, or at the very least rafts capable of carrying people and supplies across potentially lethal waters patrolled by sharks and swept by unpredictable currents. And yet, they crossed. By 65,000 years ago, perhaps earlier, humans had reached the northern coast of Australia. The evidence is unambiguous. Stone tools, charcoal from hearths, the bones of hunted animals all dated to this extraordinary antiquity. This crossing represents one of the most significant cognitive and technological achievements in human history. It required planning, the construction of watercraft, the ability to navigate out of sight of land, and the courage or desperation to attempt a journey from which there might be no return. Those who made that crossing were the ancestors of the Aboriginal Australians and the Papuans, populations that would remain isolated from the rest of humanity for tens of thousands of years, developing unique cultures, languages, and genetic adaptations to their island continent. But while some humans were sailing to Australia, others were taking a different path. From the Indian subcontinent, populations began moving north and west, penetrating into Central Asia and the Iranian plateau. This was a far harsher environment than the tropical coasts. These were continental interiors, subject to extreme seasonal variations, baking hot in summer and bitterly cold in winter. Survival here required different skills, the ability to hunt large terrestrial game, to create clothing and shelter against the cold, to find and exploit seasonal food sources like migrating herds and ripening plant foods. And here, in the highlands and steppes of Western Asia, something extraordinary happened. The migrating Homo sapiens encountered another species of human. The Neanderthals had lived in Europe and Western Asia for hundreds of thousands of years, evolving in isolation from the African lineage, adapting to the Ice Age climates of the north. They were robust, heavily muscled, with broad faces and large noses adapted to warm and humidify the frigid air they breathed. Their brains were as large as those of modern humans, sometimes larger. They made sophisticated stone tools, controlled fire, buried their dead, and possibly even created symbolic art. They were not the brutish cavemen of popular imagination. They were a successful, intelligent human species that had survived multiple glacial cycles. When Homo sapiens and Neanderthals met, they did not annihilate each other. They interbred. Genetic analysis of both ancient and modern DNA has revealed that this interbreeding was not a single event, but an extended period of contact and gene flow lasting thousands of years. The descendants of these unions carried genes from both lineages. Today, anyone of non-African descent carries approximately 1 to 3% Neanderthal DNA in their genome, genetic fragments inherited from ancestors who lived 50,000 years ago. These fragments are not random. Some Neanderthal genes provided advantages in the new environments Homo sapiens were encountering, genes related to skin pigmentation, allowing for adaptation to lower UV levels at northern latitudes, genes involved in immune response, providing resistance to diseases endemic to Eurasia, and genes affecting metabolism, helping cope with different diets and climates. The meeting between these two human species, separated for more than 500,000 years of independent evolution, must have been extraordinary. Imagine the scene. A band of Homo sapiens, perhaps 20 or 30 individuals, families travelling together with children, elders and young hunters, moving through a river valley in the Levant or the foothills of the Zagros Mountains. They are following game, tracking a herd of wild horses or aurochs through unfamiliar territory, and then, across a meadow or from the mouth of a cave, they see others. People, but not quite like themselves. Shorter, more robustly built with brow ridges and receding chins, faces that look almost but not quite human. The strangers watch them, wary but not fleeing. They carry spears, wear animal skins, and have the bearing of people who know this land, who have lived here for countless generations. What happened in that moment? Was there hostility, a tense standoff with weapons raised? Or was there curiosity, a cautious approach, communication attempted through gestures and vocalizations? We will never know the details, but we know the outcome. These groups did not simply avoid each other or engage in warfare to the exclusion of all else. They interacted, they traded, and eventually they mated. The genetic evidence is unambiguous. Homo sapiens and Neanderthal individuals formed relationships intimate enough to produce children, and those hybrid children were viable, capable of growing to adulthood and reproducing in their turn, passing on the mixed genetic heritage to future generations. Recent research has pushed the date of this interbreeding closer to the present than previously thought. Analysis of ancient genomes from Europe and Asia suggests that the main pulse of Neanderthal Homo sapiens interbreeding occurred between 50,000 and 45,000 years ago, a relatively narrow window of time. This was not a long period of peaceful coexistence and gradual blending of populations. It was an intense, relatively brief interval of contact as Homo sapiens populations rapidly expanded into territories that had been exclusively Neanderthal domain for hundreds of thousands of years. But the interbreeding was not entirely beneficial. Some Neanderthal genes were deleterious, causing reduced fertility or increased susceptibility to certain diseases. These genes were gradually purged by natural selection over subsequent generations. Interestingly, Neanderthal DNA is not evenly distributed across modern human genomes. There are deserts, regions of the genome where Neanderthal sequences are conspicuously absent, particularly in areas related to brain function and reproduction. This suggests that hybrid incompatibilities existed, genetic mismatches that made it difficult for Neanderthal and Homo sapiens genes to work together harmoniously in certain crucial functions. The X chromosome, one of the sex chromosomes, shows a particularly strong depletion of Neanderthal ancestry. This pattern is consistent with Haldane's rule, a principle in evolutionary biology which states that when hybrids between two species show reduced fitness, it is usually the heterogametic sex, males in mammals, that suffers most. Male hybrids between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens may have had reduced fertility, causing genes on the X chromosome inherited from Neanderthals to be selected against. Over time, this selection pressure would have removed most Neanderthal sequences from the X chromosome while leaving autosomal chromosomes, the non-sex chromosomes, with a moderate level of Neanderthal ancestry. But where Neanderthal genes were beneficial, they were retained and in some cases increased in frequency through positive selection. One of the most studied examples is the immune system. Neanderthals had lived in Eurasia for hundreds of thousands of years, exposed to diseases and pathogens that did not exist in Africa. Their immune systems had evolved to recognize and fight these local threats. When Homo sapiens arrived from Africa, they encountered these same pathogens for the first time, and their African evolved immune systems were ill-prepared. The interbreeding with Neanderthals provided an instant upgrade, introducing immune genes that had already been battle-tested against Eurasian diseases. Genes in the major histocompatibility complex, a region of the genome crucial for immune function, show strong signals of adaptive introgression from Neanderthals. Some of these genes are found in high frequencies in modern populations, much higher than would be expected if they were simply drifting neutrally. This is positive selection in action, natural selection favouring individuals who carried these Neanderthal immune variants because they survived infections that killed others. In a very real sense, Neanderthal genes helped Homo sapiens survive in Europe and Asia, providing a genetic shield against invisible killers that our African ancestors had never encountered. Other Neanderthal genes affected physical traits. Skin and hair colour genes inherited from Neanderthals likely helped modern humans adapt to the lower UV radiation levels at northern latitudes. In Africa, dark skin is advantageous, protecting against intense sunlight and reducing the risk of skin cancer, while still allowing sufficient vitamin D production. But at higher latitudes, where sunlight is weaker and arrives at a lower angle, dark skin can be a disadvantage, blocking too much UV and leading to vitamin D deficiency. Lighter skin, produced by variants in genes like SLC24A5 and TLC45A2, allows more UV penetration, increasing vitamin D synthesis. Some of these light skin alleles appear to have been inherited from Neanderthals, providing a shortcut to adaptation that would have otherwise taken thousands of years of natural selection to achieve. Genes affecting hair texture, the shape of teeth, and even pain tolerance have been linked to Neanderthal ancestry. A variant in a gene called SCN9A, which affects pain perception, is more common in people with higher Neanderthal ancestry. People carrying this variant report feeling pain more intensely, particularly in response to skin damage. Why this gene was beneficial to Neanderthals, or why it has been retained in modern populations, is still unclear. It may be a neutral variant, carried along because it happens to sit next to other genes that were under selection, or it may have had benefits that we do not yet understand, perhaps related to detecting environmental dangers or tissue damage in cold climates where numbness could lead to frostbite. The interbreeding also had unexpected modern consequences. Some Neanderthal gene variants have been linked to increased risk of certain diseases in modern populations, including type 2 diabetes, Crohn's disease, and even depression. These associations are complex and not fully understood. A gene that was beneficial in the Pleistocene environment, helping Neanderthals store fat during times of scarcity or modulate immune responses to specific pathogens, might be maladaptive in modern environments with abundant food and different disease burdens. The mismatch between the environment in which these genes evolved and the environment in which we live today can turn former advantages into liabilities. In Asia, Homo sapiens encountered yet another human species, the Denisovans, known from only a handful of fossils, a finger bone, a few teeth, and a jawbone, but whose genetic legacy is written in the DNA of modern populations. Denisovans were closely related to Neanderthals, sharing a common ancestor around 400,000 years ago, but they had diverged into a separate lineage, spreading across Asia while the Neanderthals moved west into Europe. The interbreeding between Homo sapiens and Denisovans occurred later than the Neanderthal admixture, after modern humans already carried Neanderthal genes. Today, people of Melanesian descent, inhabiting Papua New Guinea and surrounding islands, carry the highest levels of Denisovan DNA, up to 6% of their genome. This Denisovan genetic legacy is not just a historical curiosity, it had functional consequences. One of the most striking examples is the EPAS one gene variant, found in Tibetan populations, which allows them to live at high altitudes without suffering from altitude sickness. This gene appears to have been inherited from Denisovans, who themselves had adapted to life in the high plateaus and mountains of Central Asia. When Homo sapiens populations moved into Tibet and the Himalayas, they interbred with Denisovans and inherited this adaptive advantage, allowing them to colonize one of the harshest environments on Earth. The picture that emerges from the genetic and archaeological evidence is not one of a single, simple migration, but a complex braided stream of populations moving, mixing, splitting, and sometimes disappearing. Early waves of Homo sapiens left Africa, encountered other human species, interbred, and in some cases died out without leaving descendants in modern populations. Later waves followed, sometimes replacing earlier populations, sometimes absorbing them. The genetic landscape of Eurasia during the late Pleistocene was a patchwork of different human lineages, all related, all capable of interbreeding, but each carrying unique genetic signatures shaped by their particular histories and environments. Around 45,000 years ago, Homo sapiens populations began penetrating into Europe in significant numbers. Europe at this time was Neanderthal territory. They had lived there for 250,000 years, weathering multiple glacial and interglacial cycles. But when modern humans arrived, bringing with them more sophisticated tool technologies, more complex social organizations, and possibly advantages in communication and planning, the balance shifted. Within 10,000 years, the Neanderthals were gone. The last known Neanderthal populations clung to refugia in southern Spain and Gibraltar until around 40,000 years ago, and then they vanished from the fossil record. The cause of Neanderthal extinction is still debated. It was likely not simple replacement through violence, though conflicts certainly occurred. Competition for resources in an environment of shrinking territories as glaciers advanced probably played a role. Neanderthal populations were small and fragmented, making them vulnerable to stochastic events like disease or local environmental disasters. And the interbreeding with Homo sapiens, while it allowed some Neanderthal genes to survive, may have contributed to the demographic swamping of distinct Neanderthal populations, their genetic identity diluted and absorbed into the larger, more numerous modern human populations. As humans spread into Europe, they brought with them an explosion of cultural innovation. The Upper Paleolithic, beginning around 40,000 years ago, saw the appearance of representational art, cave paintings and carved figurines depicting animals, humans and abstract symbols. Musical instruments, flutes carved from bone, have been found in caves in Germany, showing that these people created not just visual art but auditory experiences, music and rhythm. Elaborate burials, with bodies adorned with shell beads and ochre, grave goods like tools and ivory carvings placed alongside the dead suggest belief systems concerning an afterlife or the status of individuals within their communities. This cultural fluorescence was not limited to Europe. Similar innovations appear in Africa and Asia around the same time, suggesting that the cognitive capabilities underlying symbolic thought and complex culture were pan-human, emerging independently in different populations or spreading through cultural exchange as populations remained in contact through trade and migration. The human species had crossed a threshold, moving from beings who could make tools and control fire to beings who could create meaning, who could externalize their inner mental worlds through art and symbol, who could pass down knowledge not just through demonstration but through stories and songs. But even as humans flourished in the old world, the greatest challenges and the most extraordinary journeys still lay ahead. The Americas and the remote islands of the Pacific remained unpopulated by humans. These final frontiers would require not just walking, but navigating open oceans and crossing frozen wastelands, pushing the limits of human endurance and ingenuity to their breaking point. The route into the Americas was blocked for much of the late Pleistocene by an insurmountable barrier, the Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets, vast glaciers that covered all of Canada and extended south into what is now the northern United States. But around 16 to 15,000 years ago, as the climate began to warm and the Ice Age loosened its grip, corridors began to open. One ran along the western coast of North America, between the retreating glaciers and the Pacific Ocean. Another was an interior route between the two major ice sheets. Exactly which route the first Americans took, or whether they used both, remains uncertain, but archaeological evidence makes clear that by 15,000 years ago, humans had reached the southern tip of South America, a distance of more than 15,000 kilometers from Beringia, the land bridge that connected Siberia and Alaska during times of the low sea level. The speed of this expansion is breathtaking. To travel from Alaska to Patagonia in just a few thousand years required not just mobility, but incredible adaptability. The migrants passed through every climate zone on Earth, from Arctic tundra to temperate forests, from high mountain plateaus to tropical rainforests, from deserts to wetlands. Each environment required different survival strategies, different technologies, different knowledge. And unlike the gradual expansions across the old world, which took place over tens of thousands of years, allowing time for biological and cultural adaptation, the colonization of the Americas was rapid, almost explosive. These people were not slowly evolving to fit new niches. They were using culture, knowledge, and technology to make themselves fit, creating the tools and strategies needed to survive wherever they found themselves. The Americas they entered were a megafaunal paradise, a land of giants unlike anything that exists today. Mammoths and mastodons, relatives of modern elephants but covered in thick woolly coats, roamed in vast herds across the grasslands and forests. Ground sloths, some species weighing several tons and standing as tall as a giraffe when rearing on their hind legs, browsed from trees and stripped vegetation with massive claws. Glyptodonts, armoured mammals the size of small cars with domed shells and spiked tails, grazed on grasses like oversized armadillos. Giant beavers, as large as modern black bears, built dams and lodges in the rivers of North America. Short-faced bears, towering predators with long legs built for running, hunted across the open plains. Saber-toothed cats, dire wolves, American lions, and scimitar cats formed a guild of predators as diverse and dangerous as anything that existed in prehistoric Africa. The arrival of humans in the Americas coincided with a massive extinction event. The megafauna, the giant mammals that had dominated the continents for millions of years, began to disappear. Mammoths and mastodons, ground sloths the size of elephants, giant beavers, saber-toothed cats, dire wolves, short-faced bears, all vanished within a few thousand years of human arrival. The cause of this extinction is hotly debated. Climate change was certainly occurring. The end of the Ice Age brought dramatic shifts in vegetation and rainfall patterns. But the timing is suspicious. The extinctions followed the wave of human expansion from north to south. and the pattern is consistent with overkill, human hunting pressure on naive populations of large animals that had never encountered human predators before. The overkill hypothesis, first proposed by paleontologist Paul Martin in the 1960s, argues that human hunters, armed with effective weapons and cooperative hunting strategies, could drive prey species to extinction within centuries. The megafauna of the Americas, having evolved in the absence of human predators, would have lacked the behavioural adaptations that African and Eurasian megafauna had developed over millions of years of coexistence with hominins. An African elephant that sees a human knows to be wary, to keep its distance, to protect its young. This wariness is not instinctive but learned, passed down through generations, a cultural knowledge maintained in elephant societies through teaching and memory. But an American mammoth had never seen a human. It would have had no reason to flee, no understanding that these small bipedal creatures were dangerous. The first encounter might have been curious rather than fearful, and by the time the mammoths learned to fear humans, it was too late. Their populations were too small, too fragmented to recover. The archaeological evidence for overkill is mixed. Kill sites, locations where human hunters butchered megafauna, are relatively rare. The most famous is the Clovis culture, named after a distinctive style of stone projectile point found across North America, dating to between 13,000 and 13,500 years ago. Clovis points are beautifully made, fluted spear tips that fit securely into wooden shafts and could be thrust or thrown with considerable force. At several sites, Clovis points have been found embedded in mammoth bones or lying among the scattered remains of butchered animals, clear evidence that humans were hunting these giants. But whether hunting alone could drive extinctions is debated. Computer models of megafaunal population dynamics suggest that even low levels of hunting, taking only a small percentage of the population each year, could be enough to tip slowly reproducing species into terminal decline. Mammoths, like modern elephants, had long generation times, taking decades to reach sexual maturity and giving birth to a single calf after a gestation period of nearly 2 years. If human hunters preferentially targeted juveniles and young adults, the easiest and least dangerous prey, they could have disrupted the age structure of mammoth populations, removing the individuals who would have been the breeders of the next generation. Even a small reduction in recruitment, the number of young reaching adulthood each year, sustained over decades, would have compounded into population collapse. Other researchers point to climate change as the primary driver, with human hunting playing a secondary role. The end of the Pleistocene brought rapid warming, causing vegetation zones to shift. The Mammoth Steppe, a unique ecosystem of cold-adapted grasses that supported vast herds of megaherbivores, began to fragment and disappear, replaced by forests in some areas and tundra or desert in others. As the habitat shrank, megafaunal populations declined simply due to loss of food and living space. Humans may have delivered the final blow, pushing already stressed populations over the edge, but the underlying cause was environmental change beyond any one species' control. The truth is probably a combination of both factors. Climate change and human hunting acted synergistically, each amplifying the effects of the other. A population stressed by habitat loss is more vulnerable to hunting pressure. Conversely, a population already reduced by hunting has less genetic diversity and less ability to adapt to changing environments. Together, these pressures created a perfect storm of extinction that swept across the Americas, removing almost all of the megafauna within a geological instant. Within a remarkably short time, the megafauna were gone and the Americas were transformed. The ecosystems that had been shaped by these giant herbivores and the predators that hunted them collapsed and reorganized. Grasslands that had been maintained by mammoth grazing became forests. Seed dispersal systems that had relied on mastodons eating fruits and defecating the seeds, miles away broke down, causing some plant species to decline or shift their ranges. The removal of the megafauna was not just a loss of charismatic species, it was a fundamental restructuring of the ecological order, and humans, whether intentionally or not, were the primary architects of that change. While the Americas were being settled, another extraordinary chapter of human expansion was unfolding in the Pacific. The The islands of Oceania, scattered across millions of square kilometres of open ocean, represented a challenge unlike any humans had faced before. The Australian continent and New Guinea had been reached tens of thousands of years earlier by short ocean crossings from Southeast Asia. But the islands of Polynesia, Micronesia and Melanesia lay thousands of kilometres from the nearest land masses, separated by vast stretches of water with no intervening islands, no visible landmarks, and no guarantee that land existed at all in the direction one was sailing. The settlement of the Pacific required sophisticated maritime technology. The Austronesian peoples, originating from Taiwan and the Philippines around 5,000 years ago, developed outrigger canoes capable of long-distance voyaging, double-hulled vessels that could carry families' supplies and even livestock across open ocean. They became master navigators, reading the stars, the swells, the flight patterns of birds, and the colour of the water to find their way across the trackless sea. They carried with them a package of crops, taro, yams, breadfruit and animals, pigs, chickens and dogs, creating portable ecosystems that could be established on uninhabited islands. The navigation techniques these voyagers developed were extraordinary, a complex body of knowledge passed down through generations, encoded in chants, stories, and practical training that began in childhood. Polynesian navigators learned to read the ocean as if it were a book. The swells, the long rolling waves generated by distant weather systems moved in consistent patterns that could be used to maintain a bearing, even when stars were obscured by clouds. By lying in the bottom of the canoe and feeling the rocking motion, an experienced navigator could distinguish between different swell systems, identifying the direction from which each came and using them as a compass that never failed. The stars provided directional information, but not in the same way they are used in Western navigation. Polynesian navigators did not calculate latitude or use instruments to measure angles. Instead, they memorized star paths, the rising and setting points of specific stars throughout the year, creating a celestial map that covered the entire horizon. By knowing which stars rose directly over specific islands, they could aim for that star's rising point and know they were on the correct bearing. The system was flexible and robust, working even when storms blew them off course because they could recalculate their position based on the stars they could see and adjust their heading accordingly. Birds were living signposts. Certain seabirds, like the white tern and the frigate bird, travel long distances from land to feed, but return to their nesting sites every evening. By observing the direction birds were flying in the late afternoon, navigators could infer the direction to land, even if that land was below the horizon and invisible. The distance could be estimated based on the type of bird. Some species ranged only 30 or 40 kilometres from shore. Others could travel over 100 kilometres. By knowing the behaviour of each species, navigators could gauge how far they were from land and adjust their course. The colour and behaviour of the water also provided clues. Shallow water over submerged reefs appeared lighter, a pale turquoise distinct from the deep blue of open ocean. Choppy water could indicate current patterns or the presence of underwater features. Clouds that formed over islands, building up during the day as the land heated faster than the surrounding ocean, could be seen from great distances. A dome of white against the blue sky revealing the presence of land long before the island itself was visible. The expansion into the Pacific happened in pulses, spreading first through the islands of Melanesia and Micronesia, then pausing for over 1,000 years before the final great push into Polynesia around 3,000 years ago. By 1,200 years ago, Polynesian voyagers had reached Rapa Nui, Easter Island, one of the most remote inhabited places on Earth, and by around 1,000 years ago they had discovered and settled New Zealand, the last major landmass on the planet to be colonised by humans. This final chapter of expansion represented not just physical endurance, but unparalleled courage and navigational skill, sailing into the unknown with only the confidence that land must exist somewhere beyond the horizon. The distances involved are staggering. The voyage from Tahiti to Hawaii, a route that was made repeatedly as the Polynesians maintained contact between these far-flung settlements, covered over 4,000 kilometres of open ocean. The voyage to Easter Island from the nearest inhabited land required sailing over 2,000 kilometers into the open Pacific, with no way of knowing if any land existed in that direction. These were not accidental drifts, castaways blown by storms who happened to find land. These were intentional voyages of exploration and colonization, planned expeditions that carried not just people, but the resources needed to establish new settlements, seeds, and cuttings of plants, breeding pairs of animals, tools, and knowledge. The evidence that these voyages were intentional comes from the genetics of the transported species. The pigs, chickens, and dogs found on Pacific Islands are genetically related to those from Southeast Asia, showing that they were deliberately carried and bred, not wild animals that happened to stow away. The crop plants, taro and yams and breadfruit, do not grow wild on remote islands. They had to be brought by humans who understood their agricultural requirements and knew how to establish them in new environments. And the settlement patterns, with islands being discovered and colonized in a consistent east to west or south to north pattern, suggest exploration strategies, systematic searching rather than random wandering. But these voyages were also incredibly dangerous. The ocean is unpredictable and unforgiving. Storms could arise without warning, swamping canoes or driving them off course. Becalmed in the doldrums, voyagers could drift for weeks, running out of water and food. Navigation errors, a miscalculation of bearing or a misidentification of a star, could lead to sailing past an island in the dark, missing it by kilometers and continuing on into empty ocean until supplies ran out. The archaeological record of the Pacific is not just a record of successful voyages, but of abandoned settlements, islands that were colonized and then depopulated, possibly because the settlers could not sustain themselves, or because return voyages failed and contact was lost. The settlement of Easter Island is a case study in the risks and costs of extreme isolation. The island, when discovered, was covered in palm forests and supported a population of the large seabirds. The Polynesian settlers cleared the forests, used the wood for canoes and houses, and hunted the birds to extinction. Within a few centuries, the island was deforested, and without trees to build seaworthy canoes, the inhabitants were trapped. They could no longer fish in deep water or attempt to return to other islands. The population crashed, and the society collapsed into conflict and cannibalism. Easter Island became a stark illustration of what happens when human expansion reaches its limits, when there is nowhere left to go and the resources of the environment are exhausted. With the settlement of the Pacific Islands, the human diaspora was complete. In the span of roughly 70,000 years, a single species had spread from a corner of East Africa to every habitable continent and most of the inhabitable islands. Homo sapiens had become a global species, the first and only animal to achieve such total geographic dominance through cultural rather than biological adaptation. Polar bears evolved thick fur and layers of fat to survive the Arctic. Camels evolved the ability to store water and tolerate extreme heat. But humans did not evolve to fit these environments. They invented clothing, built shelters, created tools, and passed down the knowledge of how to survive through teaching and tradition. This remarkable capacity for cultural adaptation, for learning and transmitting knowledge across generations, was the key to human success. Unlike genetic evolution, which operates on timescales of thousands to millions of years, cultural evolution can happen in a single lifetime. A skilled hunter discovers a better way to knap stone into a sharper blade. Within weeks, he teaches this technique to others in his group. Within a generation, everyone is using the improved technology. No mutation is required. No waiting for natural selection to slowly favor those who happen to inherit beneficial traits. Culture allows populations to respond to new challenges with a speed that biology cannot match. But this cultural transmission requires something that no other animal possesses to the same degree: language. The human ability to communicate complex, abstract information through spoken and eventually written language was the technology that made all other technologies possible. Language allows us to describe things that are not present, to talk about events that happened in the past or might happen in the future. It allows us to share knowledge gained by one individual with an entire community and to preserve that knowledge across generations through storytelling and teaching. Without language, each generation would have to rediscover fire, reinvent the spear, relearn which plants are edible and which are poisonous. With language, knowledge accumulates, building on the discoveries of ancestors who lived centuries or millennia ago. The archaeological record shows evidence of increasingly sophisticated cultural practices as humans spread across the globe. Burials become more elaborate, with grave goods and ochre suggesting belief in an afterlife or concern for the status of the deceased. Art appears in many forms: cave paintings depicting animals and hunting scenes, carved figurines of humans and animals, abstract patterns and symbols whose meanings are lost to us. Musical instruments, bone flutes capable of producing melodic notes, indicate that these people created sound for purposes beyond practical communication, suggesting aesthetic appreciation, ritual, or entertainment. These cultural innovations were not uniform across all populations. Different groups developed different technologies, different art styles, different ways of organizing their societies. Some became specialists in hunting large game, others focused on fishing or gathering plant foods. Some lived in small mobile bands, others formed larger, more sedentary communities where resources were abundant and reliable. This cultural diversity was itself an adaptation, allowing human populations to fine-tune their strategies to local conditions while maintaining the flexibility to change if those conditions shifted. But culture is not just technology and subsistence strategies, it is also identity, the stories we tell about who we are and where we come from. Every human society has origin myths, narratives that explain how the people came to be and how they came to live in their particular homeland. These myths, transmitted orally for thousands of years before writing was invented, contain echoes of real historical events, migrations and journeys preserved in symbolic form. The Aboriginal Australians have songlines, complex oral maps that describe routes across the continent, linking sacred sites and encoding knowledge about water sources, seasonal food availability, and ancestral travels. These songlines may preserve memories of the original settlement of Australia over 60,000 years ago, making them among the oldest continuously transmitted cultural narratives in human history. Similarly, Polynesian oral traditions preserve navigational knowledge and migratory histories, describing the voyages that led to the settlement of different island groups. The names of legendary navigators and the routes they took are remembered in chants and passed down through generations of voyagers. Modern research using genetic and archaeological evidence has confirmed many of these oral histories, showing that the migrations described in the stories actually happened, following the routes and sequences preserved in the traditions. This is the power of human culture, the ability to remember, to preserve, and to transmit not just practical knowledge, but history and identity across vast expanses of time. We are not just the biological descendants of those first migrants who left Africa 70,000 years ago. We are their cultural heirs, carrying forward the stories, the technologies, and the accumulated wisdom that allowed them to survive and thrive in every corner of the planet. Every language spoken today, every cultural tradition practiced, every piece of knowledge passed from parent to child is part of an unbroken chain reaching back to the origin of our species and beyond. This global expansion was not without cost. Everywhere humans went, they transformed the landscapes they encountered. Megafauna extinctions occurred not just in the Americas, but in Australia, where the giant marsupials vanished shortly after human arrival, and on islands across the Pacific, where flightless birds and other endemic species disappeared within centuries of human settlement. Humans used fire as a landscape management tool, burning forests to encourage the growth of grasslands that attracted game animals, inadvertently or intentionally altering vegetation patterns across entire continents. The world that existed before the human expansion was a wilder, more megafauna-rich place. The world that emerged afterward was one increasingly shaped by human activity, human choices, and human needs. The ecological impact of prehistoric humans was limited compared to what would come later, but it was real and profound. The extinction of megafauna altered nutrient cycles, changed vegetation patterns, and simplified ecosystems. The removal of large herbivores meant less grazing pressure on plants, allowing woody vegetation to expand in some areas and changing fire regimes. The loss of large predators cascaded through food webs, affecting populations of smaller animals and even influencing plant communities through changes in seed dispersal and herbivory patterns. Humans were not just passive inhabitants of the Pleistocene world. They were active agents of ecological change, reshaping the environments they encountered to better suit their needs. And yet, for most of the time that humans have existed as a global species, our impact was limited by our numbers and our technologies. Populations remained small, scattered across vast territories. Hunting and gathering, even when highly efficient, could only support relatively low population densities. The total human population of Earth 60,000 years ago was probably less than 1 million individuals. Even at the height of the late Pleistocene, just before the advent of agriculture, there were likely fewer than 10 million humans on the entire planet. We were widespread, but we were not yet numerous. We were clever, but we had not yet developed the technologies that would allow us to fundamentally alter the planet's climate and geochemistry. The human population remained constrained by the carrying capacity of the natural environment, the maximum number of people that could be supported by available food resources without depleting them. Hunter-gatherer societies developed cultural mechanisms to maintain populations below this carrying capacity, spacing births through prolonged nursing, infanticide in times of resource scarcity, and territorial systems that limited group sizes and prevented overpopulation. These were not gentle or egalitarian societies. Life was hard, mortality was high, and conflicts over resources led to violence and warfare. But the overall impact on the environment remained within bounds that allowed ecosystems to persist and recover. That balance would be shattered with the Neolithic Revolution, the domestication of plants and animals, and the rise of agriculture. But that is another story, a chapter that belongs to the Holocene, to the world after the ice. The great journey we have traced here, from the Horn of Africa to the ends of the earth, was accomplished by people who lived by hunting and gathering, who carried all their possessions on their backs, who built no permanent structures and left behind only the faintest traces of their passing. They were our ancestors, and they were us, genetically indistinguishable, possessed of the same cognitive abilities, the same capacity for language and abstract thought, the same dreams and fears. When you look up at the night sky and see the same stars they saw, when you feel the warmth of a fire or the chill of wind on your skin, you are experiencing the world as they did. The difference is not in our biology, but in our accumulated knowledge, the tens of thousands of years of learning and innovation that separate us from them. They walked across continents with only stone tools and fire, navigated open oceans with only the stars to guide them, and survived in environments that would kill an unprepared modern human in hours. They were tougher than we are, more self-reliant, more intimately connected to the natural world. And they were the reason we are here, the reason every human alive today can trace their ancestry back through that narrow bottleneck, back to a small group of people who looked at the horizon and decided to see what lay beyond. The legacy of the great journey is written not just in our genes, but in our psychology. The restlessness, the curiosity, the drive to explore and to see what is over the next hill. These are not modern inventions. They are ancient, wired into us by hundreds of thousands of years of selection, favouring those who moved, who took risks, who ventured into the unknown. The people who stayed behind in familiar territories when resources became scarce often died out or remained trapped in marginal environments. The people who left, who walked into uncertainty, became the ancestors of the rest of humanity. We are the descendants of movers, of wanderers, of people who could not or would not stay still. And that legacy continues. The human impulse to explore did not stop when the last island was settled. It simply changed its focus. We crossed oceans in wooden ships, climbed mountains for no reason other than that they were there, eventually left the planet entirely and walked on the moon. This drive is not rational, it is not always beneficial, but it is fundamentally human, as much a part of what makes us who we are as language or art, or the ability to imagine things that do not yet exist. As you drift towards sleep, Let your mind wander back across those 70,000 years. Imagine standing on the shore of the Red Sea, looking across the narrow strait toward Arabia, wondering what lies beyond. Imagine walking along a coastline that no longer exists, now drowned beneath hundreds of feet of ocean, following the shellfish beds and the tidal rhythms toward an unknown horizon. Imagine seeing land after days of open ocean sailing, a green island rising from the blue, knowing that your gamble has paid off and your children will have a future. Imagine the first humans to see the aurora borealis, the northern lights dancing across the Arctic sky, a phenomenon no human had ever witnessed before. Imagine standing on the shore of Alaska, looking south across a landscape stretching to infinity, empty of humans, waiting to be explored. These moments happened. These were real people, making real decisions, feeling real fear and real hope. And their choices, their movements, their stubborn refusal to give up or turn back, led directly to you. Every human alive today is the product of that journey, the latest link in a chain of survival and reproduction that stretches back without a single break to the very beginning. Your ancestors saw things no one had seen before. They walked where no one had walked. They survived impossible odds and impossible journeys, and they passed down, generation after generation, the knowledge and the genes that made you possible. The great journey is not over. We're still moving, still exploring, still driven by that ancient restlessness to see what lies beyond. But tonight, you can rest. You're safe, warm, and comfortable, protected by the accumulated wisdom of 70,000 years of human ingenuity. The fire is controlled. The shelter is secure. The night predators that once stalked our ancestors are extinct or confined to places far from here. You are the beneficiary of the longest, hardest journey any species has ever undertaken, and you have earned your rest. So close your eyes. Let the weight of the day fall away. Let your breathing slow and deepen. You're connected to an unbroken line of survivors stretching back through time to the very first humans who looked at a strange new world and decided to make it home. You carry their resilience in your DNA, their courage in your bones, their curiosity in your mind. They walked so that you could rest. They endured so that you could have this moment of peace. Sleep well. Tomorrow you will wake in a world they could never have imagined, a world that exists because they had the audacity to walk beyond the horizon and keep walking, no matter what they found. Their journey made your life possible, and in that sense they are not gone. They are here, in you, in every heartbeat and every breath. You are their legacy. You are their triumph. You are the answer to the question they asked when they first looked beyond the familiar and wondered what might lie out there in the unknown. Good night. The journey continues tomorrow.